Welcome back to the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are already somehow in week 5, and we are talking about Dickinson and science. All right, a little tease of what's coming up. So, our guiding questions for today are: what value does science have for Dickinson's poetry? How does she think, or maybe better, how do the personae, the different speakers that we meet in Dickinson's poetry, think about the relationship between science and faith, science and the natural world, science and humanity? So, back in our week on nature, I teased you with this bullet point that I'm going to expand more fully today, with the caveat that I am no scientist, I am no historian of science. So, I'm going to speak very generally about scientific developments in this period, of which there were many, 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 as you'll see on the next slide, and focus especially on things that have relevance for the poems that we read today. So, in the mid 19th century, the discrete fields of science that we know of today were beginning to develop, and folks grew increasingly specialized in their scientific work and knowledge. So, at the start of the 19th century, scientists were called naturalists. At the end of the 19th century, we have all of these different scientific fields: geology, paleontology, botany, biology, chemistry. Geology developed alongside paleontology as industrial developments like mining and political developments like national expansion, those things that we talked about weeks ago, revealed more and more about the makeup of the Earth. The world was becoming more and more observable and understandable on small and large scales. I just listed out a few scientific developments, discoveries, inventions on this slide. And as the world became more observable and understandable on small and large scales, it was more easily quantified, and its origins were being probed in ways that hadn't really happened before. So, up until about the 1860s, really right in this period that we're looking at, when Dickinson produced the bulk of her poetry, science and religion in colonial America and later the United States usually went hand in hand. A lot of ministers in English colonial America were also natural philosophers, that early term for scientists. The natural world was viewed as teleological, meaning that everything worked together with a sense of progress and order. But as the 19th century progressed and theories of evolution became more and more popular, culminating with the publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of the Species in 1859, this teleological understanding of the natural world began to fracture. Theories of evolution, like Darwin's theory of natural selection, and developing understandings of geological time through the fossil record, presented a natural order that was chaotic and random and didn't really seem like it was guided by progress or design. So, claiming that the world was millions of years old and species development relied primarily on chance and natural selection, as scientists started to do in this period, was unsettling. But you might be surprised to know that it didn't generate as much controversy in the United States, and especially in US Christianity, as you might think. It wasn't until the turn of the 20th century that the battle between creation and evolution that we associate with science and education in the United States really stuck. But I mention this tension between order and chaos because I think we see some of those tensions bubbling under the surface in Dickinson's poetry, even if they're not directly in response to Darwinian evolution. This was a whole scientific movement. Dickinson doesn't directly mention Darwin until later in life, in the 1870s and 80s, which is when folks were really in the United States and also in Britain starting to read Darwin. But a recent book by a scholar named Renee Berglund called Natural Magic just came out that talks about Emily Dickinson and Charles Darwin's relationships, separate relationships, they didn't know each other, to literature and science in the 19th century. I'm really excited to read this book. I haven't gotten a chance to read it in full yet, but Berglund talks about Dickinson's formal scientific education and even suggests that she received more of a formal scientific education than Darwin did. So I bring all of this up to highlight the things that Dickinson was learning and reading both formally in her education and then also on her own. She was the type of person who read textbooks for fun. So, in response to all of this new information, scientists in this period were interested in developing systems of classification to bring order to these new discoveries. Scientists were interested in grouping together like species, types of rocks, basically anything that could be classified in order to better understand how the different features of the natural world fit together and related to each other. Taxonomy, which is this system of classification, was expanded to include new species discovered in the fossil record, and comparative anatomy grew in popularity as scientists and interested lay readers wanted to learn more about the relationships between species. So you can see in these two examples a similar process of comparison. This is comparative anatomy. The first example is actually from a 16th century French book about birds. And the second example is from a 19th century comparison of, in this case, a human and a lion. And what I want to draw your attention to is how these two forms of comparative anatomy are using one figure, the human body, to better understand the other, and vice versa. So, this is kind of a sort of analogical way of thinking. One thing can help us understand the other. Classification also extended beyond the species level to more specific systems of classification. And one way this played out was in phrenology, which is a now debunked scientific method of predicting traits based on skull shape, size, the sort of bumps and indents on a skull. And this led, as you might imagine, to a lot of racist and sexist pseudoscience and generalizations that suggested individuals from certain people groups were predisposed to criminality, were less civilized, were intellectually inferior. And this was again generalized to apply to all individuals of a specific race or ethnic group or even gender. Dickinson references these sorts of systems of hierarchical human classification in color, caste, and denomination, which is why I mentioned that here and we read that for today. So, whether helpful or harmful, comparative anatomy, as I said, relies on analogy, which is another type of comparison that Dickinson herself often uses. So, let's take a look at a poem for an example of that. This is poem 100 in the Johnson, The Complete Poems of Emily Dickinson. A science, so the savants say, comparative anatomy, by which a single bone is made a secret to unfold of some rare tenant of the mold, else perished in the stone. So to the eye perspective led, the meekest flower of the mead, upon a winter's day, stands representative in gold of rose and lily manifold and countless butterfly. So we've talked about metaphor, simile. Analogy is slightly different. All three of these types of comparison show how things are similar, but analogies usually rely on logical connections or are argumentative, showing how two things are similar through shared characteristics or a logical connection. Analogies are sometimes more extended than a simile, even if they use similar language, right? Remember that similes are a comparison using like or as. Analogies can often use that language too, but the key is analogies don't just compare, they explain. So take, for example, a common analogy for doing something futile. If you're like, I don't know, shaking sand off of your beach towel at the beach and it just keeps blowing back. A common analogy that people use, and I actually just heard someone say this in a TV show that I was watching the other day, is that's as useful as rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. That's making a logical connection between the Titanic, which famously sunk, and this idea of doing something to try to make the Titanic different, rearranging these deck chairs, even though Titanic's still going to sink. It's as useful as that. It's as useful as shaking sand out of your beach towel, right? So in this poem, Dickinson is using analogical thinking, and comparative anatomy can kind of clue us into that, right? She's talking about a particular scientific approach to thinking about biology, thinking about origins that uses this kind of thinking. So as you read this on your own, think about what comparison Dickinson might be drawing. So a science, comparative anatomy, and the second stanza, so we have this sort of indication of comparison. One idea flows from the other, which gives us a sense that this is probably going to be an analogy, and it is. So we have comparative anatomy, by which a single bone is made a secret to unfold, and how the meekest flower of the mead upon a winter's day stands representative in gold of rose and lily manifold. This poem also uses a different pattern of rhyme than we've seen in most of the poems that we've read. In this case, we have the first and second and the fourth and fifth lines rhyming, and then the third and sixth line also rhyme. So it's a pretty complicated rhyme scheme that continues into the second stanza, again, making that clear connection between the two ideas. So what might be the comparison between comparative anatomy, between a flower and mead, either mead, the alcoholic drink made from honey, or a meadow? So I want to end on an example of Dickinson's own system of clarification in her herbarium. So this was a book in which you could collect dried samples of plants and flowers. You might use it for scientific study, as Dickinson probably did. But where contemporary systems of classification sought to group like things together based on observable traits, geological epochs, or other logical means of classification, the logic of the herbarium seems to be much more internal. As far as I can tell, Dickinson isn't really relying on a scientific taxonomy to organize these dried plants and flowers. This is available online at the Harvard Houghton Library. You can click through all the pages. You can even download images, as I've done for this slide. But have a look at that. See what kind of comparison she's drawing between between dried flowers, dried plants in these images, and think about how this herbarium itself maybe is kind of a practice in poetry and making connections between unlike things, drawing conclusions, as she does in A Science, So the Savant Says, from putting two things in conversation together. Here are just a few of my favorite slides, or a few of my favorite pages from the herbarium on this slide. Some of them are full of flowers, plants, leaves. Some of them just have a couple. And so this week we read Arcturus is his other name, A Science, So the Savants Say, which we just looked at briefly together. Surgeons must be very careful. Faith is a fine invention. I like to see it lap the miles. You've seen balloon set, haven't you? The chemical conviction, color, caste, denomination, and best witchcraft. So as you read these poems, or if you've already read them, as you go back and think about them more in light of this lecture, consider systems of classification, consider the relationship between science and real life, life outside of the laboratory, science and faith, science and experience. Arcturus is his other name. It's really about this tension between, can we still experience the world in the same way now that we have all of these scientific terms of understanding? And also think about the different voices that we hear in each of these poems. We have some really interesting personae that might not be representative of Dickinson's own thoughts on scientific developments or ideas, but might present maybe a counter argument or another perspective. So think about all of those things as you read together, as you read these poems together. And we will be back next week to talk more Dickinson. Thanks.